It is my great pleasure to welcome you today to this fourth Young Indian Scholars Conference. This conference is one of the most important annual programs of TBI. We consider it very important because through this conference, we can bring together scholars and researchers from India, Bhutan, and Nepal to present their papers and discuss on topics related to the theme Tibet and the Himalaya. Under this, to introduce a little bit about the conference, under this broad program, we have initially received 57 applications, and through selection process on the basis of 4 criteria: originality, theme, methodology, and integrity of the abstract, we have selected 30 participants and invited 5 expert panelists. So they will speak on various topics such as Tibet in India's security architecture, Tibet and Kino relations, China's water politics, and on Himalaya, geopolitical importance of Tibet, and etc. And as far as the conference is concerned, we shall have 2 panels and 1 expert panel after this inauguration on the first day. On the second day, we shall have 3 panels and 1 expert panel. And on the third panel, we have 3 panels followed by a concluding session. And on the final day morning, we will hand over the feedback forms, and you are requested to return the filler form before the concluding section. We shall have also breaks in between the sessions, and lunch will be served down there in front of the stadium. And finally, I wish the conference will be successful, and I'm sure everyone will be benefited through this conference. Thank you very much.
Good morning, and a heart welcome to Professor Thongka Badu Subar, other guests, and all the young India and Himalaya research scholars present here. I applaud you all for taking interest in Tibet studies. I would also like to thank Tibet Policy Institute for organizing this event and creating a common platform to share your research work and learning from each other. Tibet is the highest place on the earth with an average altitude of 13,000 feet above sea level and is called the roof of the world. Since major river of Asia originate from Tibet, and it has the largest reserve of fresh water outside Arctic and Antarctic, it is also popularly called the Third Pole. Tibet has a writing history of its own distinct language, currency, and national flag, unlike China. It remained a buffer zone between the 2 most population in nations of India and China, till Communist China forcefully and illegally invaded Tibet in 1959. His Holiness the Dalai Lama, along with 80,000 Tibetans, sought refuge in India and rebuilt its existence from scratch in India. The thriving Tibet community you see in India is all thanks to a consecutive government of India and its people. When Chela were in trouble, Guru helped them to preserve their unique language, culture, and identity in India. So I take this opportunity to thank India and its people on behalf of Tibetans all over the world. Tibet is going through the darkest and the most painful period in our history. The situation inside Tibet still remains grim and alarming despite China's lofty claim of having liberated and developed it. With the shrinking space to show dissent to the fraud policies of PRC, since 2009, 175 Tibetans from various sectors of society have set fire to themselves in protest against Chinese repressive policies that include political repression, cultural assimilation, population transfer, racial discrimination, economic and educational marginalization, massive environmental destruction, and discriminate exploitation of minerals, water, and forest resources. Each of these could be a case study and trophy of research in itself for you. Since the second term of Xi Jinping, we are experiencing second wave of cultural revolution in Tibet. Every symbol of Buddhism is attacked and intellect Tibetans who celebrate unique culture and way of life are targeted on the pretext nation's security and stability and then put there the burn. Tibet is turned into surveillance state with more CCTV than the Windows. CCP is limited the basic human rights with force mapping, biometry, and DNA tests, with the declared intention of capturing the next Dalai Lama. CCP is aiming to control the soul and emotion of Tibetan people, driving them to the height of desperation. Unlike Han Chinese who can move freely in Tibet, Tibetans are prisoners in this own land. Tibetans need multiple ID cards, move within Tibet. Although on paper, China pursues bilingual education policy in Tibet, in but reality, Chinese language is imposed in all the Tibetan schools as means of instruction. Teaching Tibetan language at home and in monastery during weekend and vacations are criminalized. According to Tibet Asian Institute, a US-based NGO, children as young as 4 are separated from their parents. Nearly 1 million Tibetan children live in colonial boarding schools and preschools. This includes an estimated 100,000 children aged 4 to 6 in preschools and more than 800,000 children aged 6 to 18 in primary and secondary schools. Children are forcefully taken away from their parents and put their colonial boarding school where the children's cultural identity is erased and are indoctrinated. China is disrupting the natural flow of the rivers by diverting them to China and pursuing a series of mega dams to create their hurdle power on the downstream countries, including India. Unbridled exploitation of Tibetan mineral resources is contaminating the rivers with soil erosion. This poses equity and terrestrial ecosystem to degrade and poses a great threat to the downstream countries. The Chinese is playing havoc with Tibetan's fragile ecosystem, making the climate security of Asia countries critical and thereby impacting the world's climatic condition. Tibetan Parliament in exile is committed to the middle way policy envisioned by His Holiness and adopted by the Tibetan Parliament in exile. For it to work, we must speak out of the status of Tibet. We must counter Beijing's claim that Tibet was part of China since antiquity. We need to make it clear that Tibet is an occupied country. it was never part of China historically, and that was forcefully and illegally invaded by Communist China. I would encourage some of your research on the historical phase of Tibet and China and prove their world. The India never had a common border with China. I want to end my speech with a positive note that today's young research scholar will be the leader of tomorrow who will dispel the darkness of misinformation that communist China is spreading to mislead the world. May the will and the aspiration of the people prevail over the atrocity and brutality in this world. I wish you all a very fruitful and successful conference. Thank you.
Now, I have been arguing that, well, this cannot be enough reason for denouncing the use of plural Himalayas, because Himalayas also can be used in order to talk about the plurality of the Himalayas, about the diversity of the Himalayas, and also the divisibility of the Himalayas, which otherwise will be difficult. And also will be difficult to talk about the Tibet and the Himalaya. If you use the word Himalaya in singular sense, the sense in which Ram Rao used it, and the sense in which Maharaj Pandit used it, it'll be impossible to divide Himalaya and the Tibet separately. So in this context, I would just like to say that two young scholars have provided a kind of way out of this Himalaya or Himalayas debate by using expression called Highland Asia in a recent book published this year actually called the Routledge Handbook of Highland Asia. The editors are Yella Wouters and Michael Hennis. Yella Wouters teaches in Bhutan and Michael Hennis teaches in Norway. And there is one other thing that I would like to draw your attention to about this fourth Young Indian Research Scholars Conference. Because, first of all, you have also invited a not so young person like me. So technically, I'm also out of this list of Young Research Scholars Conference. But more importantly, you have also invited scholars from Nepal and Bhutan. Now, Nepal and Bhutan, I don't know whether they've come here or not, but to talk about, to invite people scholars from Nepal, Bhutan, and also Tibetan scholars to a conference meant for Indian research scholars, young research scholars, is perhaps not a very sensitive thing to do. I do not think that the organizers had any kind of meaning to undermine the nationalities of Nepal, Bhutan, and the Tibetan nationality. They would never do that. But to call them to a forum which is meant for Indian research scholars is perhaps not a very sensitive thing to do, and perhaps if I were not an Indian and perhaps a proud Indian, I would not have responded to this invitation, because I would not be able to prove that I was an Indian. If I were a Nepalese or a Tibetan or a Bhutanese, I would perhaps not responded. I would not say no, but not responded. So this is an aspect that TPI could perhaps look into it a little more sensitively or carefully in future. The title of my lecture this morning is Remembering Tibet. This was not announced because I was never asked what would be the title of my presentation. What I argue here is simple, which is what we do not remember, we do not know. because remembering in the form of words, sounds, symbols, colors, tastes, smells, etc. is part of our knowing. Particularly if we belong to societies that are rich in oral and religious traditions, such as the Tibetan. I'm aware that the Tibetans have a very rich written tradition because they are our civilization and not just a cultural society like India. So like James Scott, the celebrated author of The Art of Not Being Governed, I also believe that oral traditions are ever-changing and ever adapting to the changing socioeconomic and political conditions. Similar flexibility is, however, not expected from written traditions. So when you have both these traditions, they kind of, the written traditions provide the outer hard cover to this soft underbelly of oral traditions. Equally important is following, again, Eric Hobsbawm, who needs no introduction even outside the circle of historians, about the politics of forgetting in nation building. Hence, the interplay between remembering and forgetting is crucial to understand how the Tibetan diaspora is largely successful in preserving its national identity and nationhood. I have invoked here the concepts of remembering and by default the concept of forgetting, because I consider them both to be particularly pertinent to understanding the resilience of the Tibetan movement for freedom. What Tibetans know about Tibet is hugely based on what they remember rather than what they read about it. Many Tibetans born soon after 1950, the generation to which I belong, remember what they experienced back in their villages and towns when the Chinese occupation of their country happened without much challenge from within, except by some Khampa fighters. If some Tibetans do not wish to remember the highly stratified and exploitative aspects of the Tibetan past, it is certainly their privilege not to do so. To me, a little romanticization of the past is acceptable, as we all romanticize our past to some extent. But we must also not forget the not-so-romantic past, much like my late friend Dawa Norbu remembered of the Chinese occupation in his book titled Red Star over Tibet. Some of the Tibetans who were born in Tibet also may not remember much about Tibet, especially if they were not widely read or traveled prior to coming to India. But they would certainly remember what their respective villages were like, and would also remember some individuals, some institutions, some of the foods they ate, and some of the games they played, etc. In doing so, certain memories are sure to be forgotten, and certain others are remembered, depending on what they would like to forget. Forgetting is complementary to remembering, and there may be an element of agency in both. Thus, if there is excess forgetting, it can severely harm the cause of Tibetan movement. Tibetans born after 1980 know about Tibet largely from what their parents or grandparents might have shared with them. Not just the stories about their daily lives back in Tibet, but also the painful and fearful journey on foot or on mules across the snow-clad mountains, the initial days in the hot and mosquito-ridden makeshift camps in Assam, in Misamari and Baksadwar. Many Tibetan children of this generation have gone to schools where the medium of teaching has been other than the Tibetan language. Many of them have picked up English, Hindi, and some local languages like Nepali through their friends and classmates. On account of their primary occupation, which is petty business. Over time, they have become fluent in some of those Indian languages. They, of course, continue to speak in Tibetan with their parents, grandparents, and other Tibetans who are not fluent in any language other than Tibetan. Finally, Tibetan children born in the present century know about their past, partly from their grandparents or parents, and partly from the internet and social media. Quite a large number of books have been published on Tibetans in India by the turn of the century. But books have always been the choice of a few, and often their last choice as a source of knowledge, especially after the invention of the superbug called internet. Their grandparents' memories would have faded considerably and even become a little incongruent. This generation is different from the previous two generations I've talked about, in the sense that the members of this generation trust their mobile phones and the information from the internet more than what they hear from their grandparents and parents. Pardon me for saying this, but Tibetan children of this generation, like children of any other ethnicity in India today, think that they know everything. With each successive generation, there's a certain degree of fading of memories, which is natural, and with that, a certain degree of loss of their nationalistic fervor. But this rarely comes to a 0 point, because some memories are never allowed to fade, and some additions happen from time to time, thereby maintaining some kind of balance between the loss and gain in remembering. One would expect, theoretically speaking, the degree of loss in nationalistic fervor to be less among those who grew up outside the settlements than among those who grew up inside the settlements. However, such distinction, if any, gets blurred to a great extent because many from the settlements go out for school, college, or university education, for business and other professional works, for entertainment, etc., on daily basis, spending several hours away from their settlements. That they spend a lot of time outside their settlements and mix with local people is evident from the fluency they have gained in speaking Hindi or other local languages compared to those who have remained within their settlements. Hence, the preservation of their culture, language, region, etc. is more or less proportional to the amount of time they spend with people from their own community, rather than whether they live in settlements or not. The next section of my presentation is politics of remembering. I also argue in this lecture that remembering is political. We often assume that with age one tends to forget more, which is a biological theory of forgetting. But certain memories can be kept healthy by cultivating them deliberately and sharing them from time to time. Hence, both biology and politics or culture play a role in remembering. Needless to say that every Tibetan remembers something their parents or grandparents would have shared with them about Tibet. But transmitting what they remember to the next generation is not a cakewalk. They not only have to struggle with their daily existential challenges, but also with a moral dilemma about what to pass on and how much to pass on to the next generation. Their difficulty is further compounded by the rather unwelcoming attitude of the new generation about knowing their past from their grandparents and parents. How ready are they to keep their mobile phones aside in silent mode and listen to a complete story from their mother or father? Have the keepers of memory not experienced frustration after being dismissively told by this generation later? Tell me later, or I'm busy now. In my humble opinion, the new generation must be told what must be told. It should not be optional for them, like not answering certain questions in an examination hall. If they fail an examination, it is their individual failure. But if they fail as future Tibetans, their nation fails. Some Tibetans have occasionally crossed the Nepal-Tibet and India-Tibet border and made their way to India with loads of information about what is happening in Tibet. But how keen are the diasporic Tibetans to hear them out? even if they are not infiltrators sent by the Chinese. Initially, sometimes they were suspected to be infiltrators. Does the new generation of Tibetan diaspora have the patience to listen about what has happened to their homeland under the Chinese occupation? No matter how busy they are, they must hear what is happening in Tibet, which as many of you perhaps know, is no longer the Tibet it used to be once. It has changed so much that the word change sounds inadequate to represent all that is happening there. There is change in diasporic Tibet as well, but the change in the latter is often counterbalanced by continuity. One of the most important changes that has taken place in the Chinese Tibet is in the field of infrastructure. Construction of roads, railways, prefabricated houses, airfields, etc. in almost every strategic location of Tibet is known to many, albeit often through tourist sources, which in turn are fed by the Chinese government, as the now famous Chinese scholar Emily Ye writes in her book Taming Tibet, published in 2013. The remembering by tourists, especially by Chinese tourists, is full of praise, even as they concede that they were taken on routes that were government-sponsored or approved. Writes Dan Simir Yu, another well-known Chinese scholar, in his book Mindscaping the Landscape of Tibet, published in 2015. The information regarding changes in other fields, like ethnic composition, education, culture, and religion, are, however, often contested between the Tibetan and the Chinese sources, and at times between Tibetan sources themselves. Tibetans have indeed grown diverse regarding many things. I only hope that this diversity of ideas and ideologies within the Tibetan society does not lead to a divided society. Regarding ethnic composition of Tibet, it is often claimed that there are more Hans in Tibet, more Chinese in Tibet, than the Tibetans themselves. However, I hope that this numerical overpowering of them, true as it may be, has not translated into overpowering of their soul and mind. It is indeed difficult to say how real and deep are the changes among the Tibetans in Tibet. Being a deeply religious and spiritual people, Tibetans are not likely to give up easily on their religion or culture, which in turn is hugely shaped by their religion. And why on earth should they give up? In my humble opinion, even the Chinese will, in the long run, respect them for not giving up on their culture, religion, and language, rather than becoming a bad copy of themselves. Most Tibetans in Tibet are today helplessly watching their culture, religion, and language being Sinicized, which is unfortunately happening without their consent, without being asked whether or not they would like to change in the manner they are being changed. But as long as the Chinese grip on them is firm, Sinicization will continue in Tibet, making the Chinese Tibet over time drastically different from the diasporic Tibet. More different the Chinese Tibet becomes, more difficult it will be for the diasporic Tibetans to return and reroute themselves. Circles can fit into circles and squares into squares, but if the diasporic Tibet is eventually circular and the Chinese Tibet is square in shape, return and resettlement will be more challenging than their fleeing Tibet and settling in India or elsewhere in the world. The final title of my presentation is One or Multiple Tibets. This is year 2022, and there is no longer one Tibet. Not that it has always been so in the past, not the least ethnographically, because ethnographic accounts of Tibet have been very diverse. But attempts to project Tibet as one single nation state have not been lacking either, both from within, means by Tibetans, and by some Western scholars as well. Here I wish to talk about three Tibets. One, the Tibet that is part of the communist China, 2, the Tibet that exists in exile, and 3, the Tibet as imagined by the diasporic Tibetans. First, the Chinese Tibet. The original Tibet is now a part of China, and unless something extraordinary happens, it is going to remain so for a foreseeable future. Freeing Tibet from the clutches of China does not appear to be doable, not at the least now, given the military might, economic power, and international clout of China. The US tried it twice by sending Khampa guerrillas trained by them, but failed both the times miserably. And it is likely that it will not deploy its own military personnel to try and liberate Tibet. In the event of a guerrilla warfare in Tibet, I doubt if the US will support Tibet even as much as it did in Ukraine or Taiwan. Unlike the initial decades of China, iron curtaining Tibet, means really closing Tibet, not letting anyone go in. Quite a lot is known about the Chinese Tibet today, not just through Chinese scholars like Simir Yu and Emily Ye, but also a host of Western scholars like Stephen Gross, Ruth Gamble, Evelyn Wassul, and Galen Merton. A lot is also known through some Tibetans who managed to escape Tibet and reach India once in a while. The narratives of such Tibetans might be true, but there is this little methodological issue of validation as far as their narratives are concerned. There are also differences of opinion among the Tibetans on the merits and demerits of what is going on in Chinese Tibet. But the fact remains that there seems no way that the giant wheel of change rolling over the roof of the world, this expression was not meant for Tibet initially, or wasn't used for Tibet, which came to be used for Tibet later on. Initially it was for the Pamir Highlands, and then it was kind of, it shifted to Tibet later. So this cannot be stopped anytime soon. Some of you may feel sad, even angry to hear this from me, but this is my assessment of the situation of Chinese Tibet. The diasporic Tibet. While about 90% of the Tibetan diaspora is found in India, their diasporic forays lead one to several countries today. In fact, it appears that an increasing number of Tibetans are leaving India for some Western countries every year, which incidentally is also the trend today for Indians in general. With the English-speaking Tibetan youths migrating to Western countries, one may even expect the epicenter of Tibetan movement to shift from India to the West. A less optimistic view, however, is that the movement will dissipate under the forces of the circumstances in which they live in the West. I've met many of them, so I have some idea about it. Those who are working, those who are in Germany and also in England. They not only have a huge burden on their shoulders to support their families and relatives back in India, but in the absence of a strong community of own people physically supporting it, the struggle for their freedom is not likely to be successful in the West. According to my own small research published way back in 1990, the Tibetan diaspora in India is broadly found in two climatic and sociocultural areas. The Tibetans living in areas like Dharamsala, Darjeeling, Dehradun, Sikkim, and Arunachal Pradesh had to struggle less to adapt to the local physical and sociocultural environment than their counterparts living in settlements in Karnataka and Odisha, or for that matter in Majnukatila and Clement Town in Dehradun, Majnukatila in Delhi. I do not mean to say that there are no tensions between them and the local people in the Himalayan areas, including in Sikkim and Bhutan. But such tensions have rarely turned into open conflicts. How well adapted they are, or they are not in a place, in my humble view, tends to influence their desire to return to Tibet. The young Tibetans in India have not seen Tibet, and they have worries big and small about their lives back in Tibet, if and when they actually go back. what do they even remember? But do they even remember the names of their villages? I think the elder brother of His Holiness did a wise thing to name his house in Kalimpong, from where I come, after the name of his village, which will always keep the memory of his village alive. But how many Tibetans who came to India in 1959-60 were as wise or as resourceful as he was? The emerging Tibet. The third Tibet that I want to talk about is the emerging Tibet. That is the Tibet that they may not have seen or known directly, but they feel that they belong to that nation, that country, that territory, which is connected to their history, tradition, culture, religion, and their very identity. They might not know what is in store for them when they go back to Tibet, if at all they do, but they want to be there no matter at what cost. But would their own people in Tibet welcome them back? I asked this question once to one of my Tibetan friends in Kalimpong, to which he replied like this, quote, "Well, we are quite hopeful that we will be welcome. But gradually, other realities of life may take over. Some relatives may help us settle down, while others may turn their back on us. This may happen, but nothing is more important for us than to be united as one nation on our own territory. We can trade anything for that," unquote. Those who wish to return to their homeland also need to remember that India, for many of them, if not all, is very close to their heart. The linkages, including marital, and interdependencies that have been built over 6 decades with non-Tibetan and also semi-Tibetan or Tibetanized communities like Sherpa, Tamang, Yolmo, Buddhamargi, Newas, and Gurungs. People in India cannot just be whisked or washed away. Parting with friends can be difficult, if not more, as it perhaps was parting with their own people in Tibet 6 decades ago. We are also not sure if the Chinese Tibet is ready to take back the diasporic Tibetans ever in future. But that is for China to decide. But are the diasporic Tibetans ready to go back to the Chinese Tibet? If asked, they would give the politically correct answer, which is a yes, but the answer is never as simple, which can be given in a yes or no. It actually depends on the outcome of negotiations on civil issues pertaining to India as well as Tibet. But going back to China, Mukt Tibet, or Tibet sans Chinese, does not seem to be a possibility anytime soon in future. Concluding lines. First of all, and please don't mind if I'm a little harsh in concluding about the Tibetans. First of all, both resident and diasporic Tibetans need to prove that they are serious of freeing Tibet from the Chinese rule, no matter how difficult that might be. If Gandhi used non-violence as his weapon to liberate India from the hands of the mighty British, the Tibetans could perhaps think of using compassion to win the heart of the Chinese. Freeing Tibet is not going to happen easily or quickly, even if there is a change of guard in China. In fact, recently when Xi Jinping was out of media, many people thought that there was a change of guard, and some Tibetans were also hoping that maybe under the new leadership things will change. But that's not going to happen, I can assure you. Mustering external support is not going to be easy either, as they will all first and foremost consider their own national interests, including India. And if they expect something miraculous to happen in China, it has to happen from within China. The heart of the Chinese has to change before China begins restoring freedom and honor to the Tibetans. No external threat or power can otherwise change the policy of China towards Tibet. Let us accept this premise and start from there. I'm raising these issues at the risk of getting rotten eggs and tomatoes on my face because I do not see that seriousness in the daily lives of diasporic Tibetans. I see them wearing Chinese jackets, using Chinese nail cutters and balms, and buying or selling Chinese clay or porcelain crockeries or Chinese silk. I'm not suggesting that all this is newly acquired consumer habits of the Tibetans. They have been consuming them for long, as they access Chinese goods through the age-old trade relations with the Chinese. They value Chinese articles from very old times, especially Chinese tools, even during the pre-Chinese era Tibet. But if they are really serious about freeing Tibet, they should start liberating themselves from their dependence on Chinese goods. In lighter vein, even when they are buying American goods, they should check if they are not made in China, because American goods are also sometimes made in China, oftentimes in fact. Dumping one or two of their used Chinese clothes and burning them in a public place on the Tibetan Raising Day on March 10th every year is not enough. I see that's the only thing happening, at least in Kalimpong. They need to show grit, determination, sacrifice, consistency, and commitment, and also, of course, planning. Like charity, the de-Sinicization has to begin from their home, nay, from their bedroom and washroom, from the toothbrush they pick up the first thing in the morning, to the porcelain mugs they use to have butter tea poured out of Chinese thermos flasks in the morning. Otherwise, it makes little difference even if Tibet is freed. Not buying, selling, or consuming Chinese goods will make no difference to the Chinese economy. When even Indian boycott of several Chinese goods, companies made no impact whatsoever. It was less than 1% impact. This, for the Tibetans, should be taken as decolonizing Tibet, not boycotting things Chinese. This is more symbolic than anything else, but they should not discount or undermine the power of symbols in their movement for liberalization of Tibet, or for liberating Tibet, This is a difficult path, but so is any fight for freedom. They have to make difficult choices and be ready for the consequences of those choices. If they do not want to do that, they might as well forget about freedom for Tibet. Forget about going back. Forget that they are in exile. Forget that they are a stateless people despite having a country of their own. Mother India can easily take care of their population, as she has done in the past for much larger populations from outside India during the last 7 decades or so. Thank you for your patient hearing. Tuchiche.
Thank you, Professor Tanga Bahadur Suba. Fifth, vote of thanks by Dr. Tenzin Desel, Senior Fellow of the Tibet Policy Institute.
First of all, I wanted to thank Speaker of the Tibetan Parliament in Exile, Khenpo Sonam Dembele, for gracing your presence on this inaugural session. So thank you very much. And second, I would like to thank Professor Tanga Bahadur Suba for delivering this excellent keynote address. He has given us much food for thought and then offered us some suggestions on how do we carry forward the conference in future. So we will take them on board. So thank you for that. And then I would like to thank Gaynter Sringla for agreeing to be with us during the entirety of the conference. So thank you very much. And then I would like to thank the host of this conference and the principal of this institute, Gebang Sangla, and of course, I would like to thank the expert panelists. So I would like to thank Professor Vasudha Pandey for coming all the way from Delhi, Professor Prashant Negi, Dr. Swati Chopla, Professor Chawla, and Joanna Coelho. So all of them, thank you very much for agreeing to be part of the expert panels during this conference. Thank you very much. And most significantly, I would like to thank all the participants for coming from different parts of India, highlands, uplands, lowlands, and all different parts of India for coming and attending the conference. And then regarding that, we'll take your suggestions on board and we'll think it through. And then I would like to thank my colleagues for putting together this conference, and particularly to the coordinator of this conference, Dr. Samal and Tundu Omula, for coordinating the entire conference. So thank you very much. And lastly, last but not the least, thank you for the media personnel who have come to cover this conference. So thank you very much. So yeah, so we hope after this session I look forward to a very engaging and very rich learning experience for all the participants and the rest of us. So thank you very much. Thank you.